Welcome to the Diocese of Madison This Week on Relevant Radio 1240 AM and 97.3 FM.
Thank you for joining us for the Diocese of Madison This Week on Relevant Radio. I'm Deacon Jim Hagemeyer, a permanent deacon of the Diocese of Madison assigned to All Saints Parish in Berlin. I also serve as Associate Director of the Apostolate for Persons with Disabilities of the Diocese of Madison. And as always, we are joined by our host, Bishop Donald Hying, the 5th Bishop of Madison. Welcome again, Bishop Hying.
Thanks so much, Deacon Jim. It's always great to be on the show with both you and our listeners.
Now, as we approach this time of year, we might even notice we see some school buses starting up on the highways, back-to-school specials at all the stores. So it's a reminder that so many people are preparing for another school year, both teachers, students, and families. And this includes our seminarians, those men in formation to become priests for the Diocese of Madison. Now, most of us might not know very much about what happens from the time a man is accepted by a diocese for seminary formation to the time he is, God willing, ordained a priest. Now, of course, you went through seminary formation to become a priest, and you also served as Dean of Formation and Rector at St. Francis de Sales Seminary in the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. So I'd like to tap your experience to help us understand, what is seminary formation? So maybe the first question might be, what is a seminary?
I think as much as we know our local priests, as much as we may be familiar with priests in our family's experience, seminaries still kind of remain mysterious places. Like what goes on there, what happens there, what's the day-to-day life like, what are the goals? The word seminary comes from Latin for seedling, so it's a place where these seeds of vocation are nurtured in men who have discerned a call to the priesthood. Interesting, seminaries are relatively new in the history of the church. They only go back to the Council of Trent, which was in the 1500s. And seminaries were set up as a response to the fact that in the Middle Ages, many of the clergy were woefully uneducated. And when especially the Protestant Reformation came along, many of them were not able to articulate what the church taught because they didn't know themselves. Some were barely literate. So seminaries were set up, mandated by the Council of Trent to ensure that men were properly formed to be priests, both intellectually, spiritually, pastorally, and in all other ways. So it's a relatively new reality in the church. Not every diocese has a seminary. Ours does not. Used to have a minor seminary, which was, here at Holy Name, until it closed in 95. So we send our men to places like Milwaukee, Detroit, Rome, Winona, Minnesota, to be formed. So when we look at formation today, it really takes 4 aspects, and that includes the intellectual, the spiritual, the human, and the pastoral. For a man that goes into college seminary, his formation is probably going to last upwards of 8 years. And so 4 years of college and then 4 years of postgraduate theological work. For someone that already has a college degree but no philosophy background, he's probably going to have to take 1 to 2 years of what we would call pre-theology, and that's learning the basics of philosophy, learning the essence of the catechism and grounded in spirituality before beginning his theological studies. So depending on when you start, seminary process is going to last anywhere from 8 to 6 to 4 years. And when you think about the skill sets that a priest needs, you realize the necessity of that much formation. So a priest is a preacher, a teacher, a presider at the sacraments, a CEO of an organization, a cheerleader, a confessor, a counselor, administrator, a boss, a supervisor, a community organizer. All of those aspects flow into the priesthood. Obviously, at the center of it is a man that has been ordained, conformed to Christ in acting and speaking in persona Christi. So the 3 fundamental missions of the priest, as are the 3 fundamental missions of Jesus himself, are to preach the gospel, to celebrate the sacraments, and to shepherd God's people.
So one thing I think it's important to keep in mind is that seminaries, they're not called necessarily colleges or schools. It's not just about academic, doing homework, reading books, writing tests, giving papers, that there's so much more to it. And you even just mentioned that all the things that a priest is called to do, especially pastors, is that reflected in the type of instructors that might be at a seminary, that, it's not just about teaching the scripture, although that's a core component, but all these other things that a priest is going to have to be prepared to face once they're ordained?
That's exactly right, Deacon Jim. So there's a difference between studying to be a priest and, say, studying to be a lawyer. So to be a lawyer, you need the legal expertise. But there's probably nothing in a lawyer's education that's going to impact every single aspect of his or her life. So that's the distinction between education, I think, and formation. So in seminary, a priest's entire being is, in essence, formed. His temperament, his personality, his will, his heart, his emotions, his communication skills, his empathy, as well as his intellect and his soul. So again, there's what we call the 4 pillars of formation. The first is intellectual, which is, studying theology, studying the scriptures, studying moral theology, the sacraments, revelation, all those essential components, the liturgy. The second is spiritual, and much of one's formation goes on in learning the spiritual traditions of Catholicism, spending much time in prayer and in spiritual direction. So the chapel is one of the places where a man is really formed to be priest. Third is pastoral formation, which is putting into practice what he is learning in pastoral settings, whether that's a parish, a school, a hospital, a prison. So a seminarian does many different internships of service. So it isn't that it's just all head knowledge and then suddenly you get thrust out into the parish. So there's a lot of practical, what we would say, field experience, where he is invited to reflect on how to integrate or put together what he's learning in the seminary and how that's applied in real life situations with people. And the fourth, and this really was beautifully emphasized by St. John Paul II in his letter on seminary formation, Pastores Dabo Vobis, I will give you shepherds, is the human formation. And when you think about it, it's something that we take for granted, and yet human formation is probably the most basic building block in the Christian life, that our humanity must be formed in order to be an effective Christian. So I always say that to be a holy and effective priest, you have to be a holy and effective Catholic. To be a holy and effective Catholic, you have to be a good human being. And many times when people talk about why they left the church, they don't cite theology, they don't cite spirituality. It's their perception, right or wrong, that someone in the church was unkind to them. So the point being, how can the humanity of a priest serve as a bridge for other people to experience God? Just as Jesus' humanity became a bridge for people to experience God. So ponder for a moment just the humanity of Christ. His humanity was perfect. So think of how attractive, loving, joyous, courteous, respectful the humanity of Jesus was. So people were drawn to that. And when they were drawn to him, he was able to also reveal God to them, because obviously he was both human and divine. So we really look at how do we help form the humanity of a seminarian so that his humanity, his whole being, becomes a bridge for people to encounter Christ.
So in discussing those 4 pillars, kind of especially priestly formation, as a man is going through seminary formation, are some emphasized more earlier on? Certainly, I think it's going to be for practical reasons, but also for other reasons. There's going to be that initial focus on the academic. I mean, you're going to have to know a lot of these things. You're going to have to know scripture. But also, as they develop some maturity, as just, with life experience, but also as they learn more, especially with the intellectual formation, I can see then there might be more of an emphasis, okay, this person's getting closer and closer to time. It looks like, God willing, he may be ordained. Well, maybe we need to focus some more on some pastoral things, or are there moments, that's what I'm asking, where there's a greater emphasis on any one of those pillars, or are they all pretty much, I'm sure they play a role throughout the entire man's formation from beginning to end, but does one, are some emphasized a little bit more during the earlier parts of the formation as opposed to maybe later parts?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say, as you said yourself, they're all kind of interwoven throughout so that each year builds on the previous. But I'd say at the beginning, there's certainly a heavy emphasis on the human formation and the academic formation. And then as a man moves closer to the priesthood, there's going to be more focus on the practicality of the pastoral life and work that he's embracing. So certainly in his last year when he's a transitional deacon, there'll be a lot of practica on literally how to celebrate Mass, how to celebrate confession, how to anoint the sick, how to preach. So those very practical things where he's going to take everything that he's learned and been formed in and then put that into motion.
You're listening to the Diocese of Madison This Week on Relevant Radio. I'm Deacon Jim Hagemeyer, and we're having a discussion with Bishop Donald Hein, the Bishop of Madison, about seminary formation and what goes into forming a man to become a priest. Now, you mentioned before that at least for the men studying in formation to be priests for our diocese, they go to different seminaries. Are some seminaries better in certain areas? I shouldn't say better, but focus more on, is there a reason why, what are the factors that go into the decision as to which young man is going to go to this seminary to be formed as opposed to a different seminary to be formed?
Yeah, that's a great question. Some of that is just a discernment on the part of the vocation director who knows them, where would they flourish the best. Men that are sent to Rome, certainly someone that has linguistic ability to live far away from home in another culture, who's going to be able to, handle that. I would say today, all the seminaries in the United States are of high quality, and you can really see the impact that the reforms and the vision of St. John Paul II have had as that has trickled down through the decades. I'd say since the late 1980s, into the 90s and now the 21st century. So something, again, that I said before, St. John Paul II really lifted up the role of human formation, really as well as the intense importance of spiritual formation. So I've always been struck, especially when I did seminary work, I'd ask laity, what are you looking for in your priest? And sometimes I'd expect them to say, a great homilist, someone that is compassionate to me, somebody that I'm comfortable going to, and all those factors played into it. But the number one response was always, I want my priest to be holy. I want a holy priest. And I'd pursue that a little bit and ask them, well, what do you mean by holy? And they would say, I want to know that my priest is seriously seeking a deeper relationship with the Lord for himself and is dedicated to prayer. And knowing that if he's intent on that, then that's going to overflow in his ministry to us, as his parishioners, as the beneficiaries of his pursuit of holiness. And sometimes we forget about that. We get so caught up in the ministerial function of the priest that we forget an elemental role here is that we want our seminarians to be men who are serious about holiness, in love with Christ, and wanting to fall more deeply in love with God and become the saint that God has called them to be.
So then, with that emphasis on the holiness, developing the holiness of young men in formation to be priests, or any man being in formation to be priests, I would assume that most seminaries place an emphasis on at least offering spiritual direction, or perhaps even having someone who's in charge of spiritual direction for all those seminarians that might be at that particular seminary.
Yeah, so every seminary would have a chief spiritual director who would oversee the whole spiritual formation component of the seminary process. In addition, each seminarian would have a personal spiritual director, and he'd be asked to see his spiritual director probably twice a month. And part of that's confession, but part of it is just helping to process with someone growth in the spiritual life, with a focus on progress in prayer, progress in virtue. How is all this coming together in my heart and spirit as I draw closer and closer to ordination?
Now, when you mention about having different men go to different seminaries, I know in more recent times we've seen an increase in, we call them older vocations, men who might be 40s, 50s, older, that often they feel this calling to be a priest. I would imagine it could be difficult for them to kind of return to a seminary program with, other guys that are young enough to be their sons.
Right.
Are there provisions for these older vocations?
Yeah, so there's certain seminaries in the country. I'm thinking of Sacred Heart in Hales Corners here in our own state of Wisconsin. Also, St. John the 23rd Seminary in Massachusetts that are really geared towards older men that are pursuing priesthood. And rightfully said, that imagine being 45 and you're going to be in formation with folks that are, 22. The other dynamic is it's often a man that's been out of school for decades. So anyone that's gone back to school after being out of school for a long time can relate to that. So those seminaries really take into effect, the reality of an older man preparing for the priesthood.
What would be a typical day in the life of a seminarian, a weekday?
Yeah, I would say early rising, so you're going to find seminarians in the chapel probably by 6:37 in the morning to pray morning prayer, part of the liturgy of the hours, probably to celebrate Mass, and then breakfast, then usually off to class. So there'll be classes throughout the day. In the evenings, on certain evenings or perhaps days of the week, will be the spiritual formation, which is not an academic subject, but a process of presentation and discussion and absorbing the beauty of our Catholic spirituality. There'll certainly be provision made for pastoral work, where a seminarian will be away from the seminary, working in a parish or a hospital or a prison. On weekends, oftentimes they will be out, perhaps going back to their home parish, again, perhaps doing pastoral work, doing their homework. So you can't be an intellectual slouch to be a seminarian. There's a lot of reading, a lot of writing. Priests are academically well-formed to be able to articulate the faith. So it's long days, a lot of scheduled events, and it's really learning to live that structure and that discipline.
In support of all men in formation, especially those who are in formation to become priests for our diocese, God willing, what are some of the things that each one of us could do to actually support the men from our diocese who are in formation to become priests?
I'd say the number one is prayer, and I've come to beautifully learn that here in the diocese, holy hours of adoration right in this building have been practiced for 15 years, praying for vocations. And when that prayer started 15 years ago, we had maybe 5-6 seminarians. Now we have upwards of 25. So just the power of prayer, the power of a diocese, lifting hearts and prayer to the Lord, asking for an outpouring of laborers in the vineyard. I think secondly, just to really be supportive of young people in our lives if they're discerning or thinking about priesthood or religious life or service in the church. And even if they're not, just to observe the qualities and perhaps say to one of them, did you ever think